Okay, so today we're going to talk about light painting. This is a technique that you can use with very simple tools and have a really interesting result. This technique is not used widely, but the people that do use it tend to create some really interesting imagery. We'll see this used sometimes in the automotive industry, but we're going to look at one particular photographer today that uses it in a lot of different circumstances. Um, okay, so let's talk about what is light painting. When we do light painting, what we're going to do is make really long exposures in a dark environment and actually paint in with the flashlight the light that we want in desired locations. Um, the benefit to this is we can use almost any type of light. I use this flashlight a lot for it. You don't have to have any sort of a fancy flashlight. It can be a really simple flashlight. You could even use your phone or light panels. We'll even see some instances where people use those large hunting spotlights, the really large, really high output lights to light massive things. Um, you will typically get pretty like high quality images out of these photos because we're going to use a low ISO. We're going to try between 200, maybe 400 ISO, and we're going to use a fairly small aperture like f8 or f16. Now, the trick is we're going to use really long exposure times, and so most exposures that you're going to do are going to be 15 seconds, 30 seconds. Most of your cameras are limited to a 30-second exposure, so oftentimes we'll use that whole 30 seconds to create our image. Now, because we're using such slow shutter speeds, you will need some sort of a stabilizing device. It's best if you have a tripod, but if you don't have a tripod, there's a lot of things that you can do to stabilize your camera. The trick is you don't want to handhold your camera. No one can handhold a 15-second exposure and it not be blurry or wobbly or out of focus or whatever. So we want to be able to set our camera up somewhere. So if you don't have a tripod, then you need to find ways to set your camera on a steady object. Maybe it's a table, maybe it's the hood of your car. It could be a lot of different things. I even will use my wallet and set my camera on like the hood of my car and use my wallet to kind of shim under it to get it at the exact right angle that I want. So you don't have to have a nice tripod necessarily, but you do have to keep your camera totally still. Also, most of your lenses, if you have a kit lens, like a kit zoom lens, it has some sort of image stabilizer on it. So sometimes it's called IS or VR. A lot of times it's a switch on the lens. You want to turn that off because what happens when your camera is totally stationary is sometimes that stabilizer will move around and give you a blurry image. So we want our lens and everything to be perfectly solid, perfectly still. Okay. So let's look at kind of how this works and how this is built. So I'm going to show you a couple of images of a picture that I made a while back. I started off with making an exposure in the dark just to kind of get an ambient light to kind of understand, how much light is already in the scene. And then I took a flashlight and I put it over on one side and I did a really long exposure and illuminated that part of the truck. Now this image is actually a composite. That means that it's a couple of pictures put together, but you could do this in one exposure if you're either fast enough or maybe if you have help with somebody on the other side. And so illuminated this side of the truck with the flashlight and then went over to the other side of the truck and lit the other side of the truck with the flashlight. And because you're moving the flashlight, you can cover a large area and it will paint in all that area as you move the flashlight and illuminate across that area. It's kind of like you're a little light painting Bob Ross. Happy trees. We're going to make happy trees. All right, so we're going to look at one guy. His name's Dave Black, and he's been doing this technique for a long time, and he's really, really good at it. He's kind of innovated a couple of different techniques with light painting, and so he's a good person to start with on how you do this. And he's also, lit massive, massive things, and all the way down to really, really small things with flashlights. And the benefit of this, again, is like everybody has a flashlight. You can do this. You just go about it in a much different way than when we're using a reflector or when we're using strobes. All right, so let's look at some of Dave Black's pictures and talk about kind of how this works in more detail. So I want you to think about your flashlight being a paintbrush. Okay, it's not a flashlight, it's a paintbrush. And as a paintbrush, you're going to paint the light onto the surface of the object that you want. Now, if you're painting like right directly from where your camera is sitting, then the light is going to be really flat and not going to look that great. So what you want to do is, trip your shutter and move around to one side and illuminate that side of the image. Walk all the way around. The more angle that you give, the more drama that you allow the image to have, because you're creating shadows. Okay, so there's a few things that you can do to make your images more dynamic. One of the things you can do is you can use gels. So gels are just clear pieces of material that have a color to them. A lot of times you'll see them at concerts and things over lights. But I've had students use Tupperware top lids or any sort of like kind of transparent colored material to shine your light through, and then you get that color of light. So if you have a red Tupperware lid or whatever, you shine a light through it, then you have a red light on your object. So you can use different things to modify the color of your light and do it. You can have red on one side and white on the other, or green on one side. The options are kind of unlimited. It's just your imagination, what you can come up with. That's kind of the joy of it. But you want to just put the light where you want it to be. If you just blast light all over everything, it's not going to be that interesting. A lot of what makes a light painting photo interesting is the shadow. It's what's not painted. It's the part that doesn't have light on it. So something that Dave Black says all the time is like, if you want to make a photo interesting, just light a part of it, not the whole thing, just some of it, because that's going to key the eye into that specific detail. So as we light just a little part of it, we also have to think about what other light is in my environment that I don't have control of necessarily, and that's really the ambient light. So if we think back to the picture of the truck that I just showed you earlier, there were some street lights in the background. There was some light pouring in on the side of the truck, like a green band of light. There's light comes from a couple of different directions, that it's already in the scene at night. Your ambient light might be the sky. It might be the stars at night. So you have to decide on, do I keep that? So do I make an exposure to keep some of that detail, or do I try to not? Do I try to get rid of that detail? And we do this by just getting a baseline exposure before we even start painting with our flashlight. So I'm going to give you a couple examples from Dave Black of how this kind of works, okay? So in a picture like this, there's a couple of things going on. For one, we have this band of blue at the very, very top. We have these rocks at the very, very bottom. Now, if we break this picture down, what's happening is he started off and he made an exposure of that skyline. He made exposure it's underexposed so that you get really saturated blue sky. And this is probably in the middle of the night or right after sunset. I mean, it's really dark outside. So he's doing a really long exposure just to get that detail in the sky. But the foreground is probably, though we see it here, it's probably all blue and black. So what he does is he uses his flashlight then to paint in the rocks on the kind of the bed of the river. So that way when you combine the part that he illuminated with his light with the ambient light, then you get a total exposure all the way across the frame. So he's just painting in part of the frame and then letting the sky illuminate the rest of the frame, but doing it like underexposing it quite a bit. So it's very dark, it's very saturated, you get a lot of color. Remember, if you want more color, you have to underexpose. If you want more saturation, you have to underexpose. Okay? Here's another one. If we look closely, at first glance, this appears to be like sunup, like the sun's coming up and these warm rays of sunshine are coming through and hitting the barn. But if we take a step back, there's still stars in the sky. The color of the blue of the sky has a certain look to it, and then there's no sunlight on the mountains. So what this tells me as I break down the image is that this is in the middle of the night. He's exposed for the night sky, and he has stars that he's exposed for. Really, really long exposure. And he's actually illuminating the barn with a flashlight. And he's using a warmer flashlight, kind of like an older, not an LED flashlight, but a flashlight that uses like a tungsten bulb. A lot of older flashlights have a warmer color to them, like a newer LED flashlight is more blue. So it's just something to keep in mind. The type of flashlight that you use has a different color. But by standing off to the side, to the far right side, and illuminating the fence line and the barn with his flashlight, he makes a total exposure. Because before, it's likely that that whole barn and that fence were almost totally black, if not really, really dark blue. And you probably didn't see much of that detail at all. But by just splashing that light on it, it really creates a depth to the image, and it's very dynamic now. And this was done over a long process of building that light up. So you can light fairly large objects like that. You can also light really, really, really small things. So if we look over here, this is an emblem to an old car. It's probably just a couple of inches big. And he uses a really small pin light, those little flashlights that look literally like a pin, to paint some of these things. So you can do really small pictures of detail, like macro shots. If you have a really tiny light source, you can do light really small things like this. Another technique that I use a lot is I'll get what's called a snoot, and that really is just like you can get a black piece of paper and wrap it around your flashlight, and it creates like it creates a cylinder around that flashlight, and it controls the light and it brings the light down to a very specific point. Something that I'll do a lot is I'll actually just take my hand and I'll grip it around the end of the flashlight, and I'll only let a little bit of light come out of my hand. It's kind of like a makeshift snoot. So that way I can paint in just a little bit of light and I don't have to blast all that light, especially for a small object. It's really easy to overwhelm a small object with too much light and too big of a light source. So I will kind of squish down and have just a little bitty bit of light just to illuminate and paint on the pieces of that I want. Because you have to be aware it's really easy for that light to spill over on the things that you don't want it to be on. So use a piece of black construction paper, or craft foam works great. Black craft foam, you can wrap it around your flashlight and it gives you just a little tiny pipe of light on whatever it is you want to illuminate. And you can literally paint in just the portions and the details that you want, leaving shadows in places. If we really look at this light on this image, it's hard to tell what the light source really is, because of the way that part of it hits certain places and not other places. Part of it is bright. Parts of the rope are brighter than other parts. It's almost confusing if you really start to look at it, because just little pieces have been illuminated over a long exposure with the flashlight, kind of working through the image. Okay, so you can do this technique with small stuff. You can also do it with massive things. I think this is where light painting becomes very interesting. So if you have a powerful enough light source, or you have enough time with a light source, you can pretty much light anything, even a planet. Now, Dave Black illuminated this, rock structure here from, I believe he said he had a camera set up in the spot that we see the pictures from, and then he had his assistant trip the camera, and then he was a mile to the right down a road with a large hunting spotlight, and they had walkie-talkies, and he just said, trip the shutter, and then the shutter was open for a very, very long time, and he would paint in on the side of that mountain with his flashlight. And so he used, whatever, like a $40 or $50 flashlight from Walmart to illuminate the whole side of, a mountain, which is pretty impressive for such a small light source. The trick is moving. As you move around, you are able to spread that light incrementally over the whole structure. So that takes a fair bit more planning than probably what we're going to do in here, but it gives you kind of unlimited options if you're photographing at night. Here's another picture that, it's hard to tell, like, how did he light all of this stuff, and really he did it little by little over a very long amount of time. As we can see, there's the exposure is made for for the stars in the sky. We can see the Milky Way. So this is a very, very slow exposure, a very long exposure. And with that really long exposure, he just starts at one end, maybe starts on the trees, and he paints in all the trees. If the camera shutter, most of his exposures are longer than 30 seconds. This could be a 5-minute exposure, a 10-minute exposure. He can gradually work his way around and paint the trees, and then paint, the shoreline, and then paint up on that rock face with this flashlight. And so little by little until the whole picture eventually builds together. He's also used, he's painted people in on structures with a flashlight. So he's standing across on top of that rock face with a flashlight, walking down the top of that rock face and painting in. And when that person is being painted, they have to stay very, very, very still because we're still dealing with a very slow shutter. So let's talk about how we light paint people, because there's it gets more complicated as we photograph and paint and illuminate things that move naturally. Okay, so just like our camera has to stay perfectly still. So do our subjects. And so when we photograph people and we light paint on people, we really have to put them in a position that they can be stable, that they won't move, that they're comfortable, because they're going to have to sit there for a long amount of time while you make an exposure. So avoid having people standing in and being in awkward positions. It's a lot easier if you have someone sitting, leaning against something, maybe having their head propped up somewhere, because they're going to have to stay perfectly still while you're painting them. So put them in a position where they can be perfectly stable. If they're standing on one leg with one leg in the air, no one can hold that for 30 seconds and not move at all and be perfectly sharp. So put people in positions to where they're not going to move around in a stable posture. Just like your camera has to be stable, your subject has to be stable. Okay? Now, as we put all of these things together, light painting large things, small things, people, then you have some interesting scenes that you can make. This is another Dave Black photo. I don't know if he was doing like bridal portraits or whatever, but as we can see, this lady is illuminated. She's sitting, even though she's in a posture that's probably difficult to hold, he probably quickly painted her and then painted the rest of the scene. And as he's painting the grass and the foliage, the wind's blowing it, and so it's being blurred. There's motion blur that's happening there from the wind blowing that. So, it creates a little different effect. I'm not sure, if it's your preference or not, but just be aware that if something moves while you're light painting it, it's going to be blurred in some way. Okay, so let's talk about your assignment and what you're going to do. So my goal for you for this assignment is that I want you to light paint 3 different things, okay? First, I want you to start with a small object. So, something smaller than a shoebox. So try to paint something smaller than a shoebox. It can be anything you want, but probably an inanimate object would be a great place to start. The next picture, I want you to photograph and light paint something that's large. I think the size of a car or bigger, okay? And this is a whole different challenge because it's going to take a lot more light, and you're going to have to move around a lot more to get the angles and things that you want to paint on. And then the last thing is I want you to light paint a person. And I would strongly suggest that you do this one last, because you need the practice of making the first 2 photos before you get to the person. You need to be a little more comfortable with the technique before you ask someone to sit down with you to paint them and to photograph them, because as you make these pictures, it's going to be a very slow trial and error type process. You'll make a picture, you'll paint it, and then after the shutter closes, you'll wait for your image to load, and then you'll look at the image and see, did it work, did it not, where do I need to paint this time, where do I need to put energy next time, do I need to move around on this side? There's a lot of trial and error that goes into this. If you're painting too much, you'll have to make an adjustment. Maybe that your flashlight isn't quite bright enough and you need to open up your aperture to like 5.6 or something. Maybe your light is too bright and you need to either paint less on what you're painting on, or you need to bump your aperture up to like f11 or f16. F8 is just a good starting point, but it's not a rule. You know, you might move it around quite a bit. You might need to bump your ISO up a little bit. There's a ton of trial and error, and every situation is different because different flashlights have different brightnesses. Your ambient light is going to have a different brightness as well. You've got to be able to kind of balance all of these things, but once you do that, you'll have some really interesting images. So since I can't be there with you, I found an instructional video online where a guy is painting on a very large building, but it gives you an idea of how that works in the field, and he has some really good advice on how to do that. And so I'm going to put a link to a card at the top right hand side of your window. So just click on that link and watch that video and kind of get an idea of how this works in real life, not just in a lecture form. And then if you have questions, you know, like, we can talk more about that as well. There, again, like, don't feel frustrated. There's a lot of trial and error that happens with this. You just have to put in the time, and you know, a lot of it is done. It has to be done in the dark, so you're gonna have to work in the evening, which is very different. Most of you have always worked, you know, in these nice like times of day where the light's really beautiful, and now you are going to be working at night, in the middle of the night. So you're going to have to shift, you know, your strategy quite a bit. So if you have questions, please let me know. I'll help as best as I can. All right, thank you, everybody.